Good evening. It's Thursday, January 18th, 2018 at 7:30. I'm calling the City of Clawson Zoning Board of Appeals meeting to order. Could everyone stand for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Victoria, can you call the roll, please?
Ms. Diane Smith.
Present.
Mr. Parker.
Present.
Mr. Sinaki.
Present.
Ms. Scripture.
Present.
Ms. Cindy Smith.
Present.
Thank you. So we received the minutes from our last meeting, December 21st, 2017. Have you all had a chance to review those?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Can I have a motion?
Madam Chair, as receiving the minutes and finding them to be in order as a record of our last zoning board of appeals meeting, I move that we approve the minutes.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Victoria, can you call the roll, please?
Mr. Parker.
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki.
Yes.
Ms. Scripture.
Yes.
Ms. Cindy Smith.
Yes.
Ms. Diane Smith.
Yes. Thank you. So at this time, I'd like to open a public meeting for the first item on our agenda. And the first item is a public hearing and consideration of request for a variance for property located at 1200 West 14 Mile Road in the Westgate District from the City of Clawson Code of Zoning Ordinances as follows. Chapter 36, Sign Regulations, Section 36-3F, Non-Conforming Signs to allow the reuse of an existing non-conforming sign support pole. Chapter 36, Sign Regulations, Section 36-9, Non-Residential Sign Regulations to allow a pole sign in excess of 8 feet in height and in excess of 32 square feet in area. Our city planner is here to present first.
Good evening, members. So as you said in your opening, the request here is for in essence, two variances. One from 36-3F of the City Code, which had provided for all non-conforming signs in the city to have been removed on or before December 31st of 2014. The sign in question is represented on the photograph that's up on the screen. It's the pole sign that's just to the east of the building on the site. As I understand their request, and they can clarify it when they get up here, it's essentially to reface the part that you see on it that said Goodyear. There's a small piece underneath it that says Phil Cavill's, and my understanding is that that would remain, but that the Goodyear piece would be replaced with Pep Boys, which is the new lessee of the property. So in order to not remove that sign, as they were required to have done by December 31st of 2014, they would need a variance from that provision of the zoning ordinance, or the sign ordinance, excuse me. And then the sign itself is also in excess of the height and area allowed for a sign under section 36-9, which is the regulations for non-residential signs in the city. And so a variance from that section would be needed as well. When they applied, they incorrectly applied for a variance from section 36-2 of the city code, which is the definitions of signs. And so we've noticed it up in the proper fashion for what we understand their request to be. So the sign that you see represented there, the freestanding sign, is about 23 feet in height. That's opposed to 8 feet, which would be allowable for a freestanding sign in a non-residential area today. And the Goodyear portion of that is about 101 square feet in area. That's as opposed to 32 square feet in area that would be allowed today. That does not count the additional signage underneath, which says Phil Cavil's on it. So I want to make clear to you that you have only one request before you right now, which is to reuse that existing sign. They have not, in their application, indicated that they want to modify it or that they're proposing to modify it to make it more conforming, and so nothing else is before the board tonight for your consideration. The standards for a sign variance are contained in section 3618 of the city code. They're different from the normal variance standards. They're specific to the sign code. We've gone through them before, but I will go through each of them and then I'll give you my observations or our observations at McKenna on each of those standards as to whether we feel it's met or not met. There's 14 of them, so I'll go through them in order. Does the proposed sign represent the business it is intended to identify? I would say yes to that. Number 2, is the sign appropriate to the business identified so as not to cause confusion or mislead the public? Our observation is that the sign is out of scale for Clawson's scheme of signage along 14 Mile Road, given that it is much higher and much larger than what is contemplated. In fact, it exceeds the height of the building on the site, and in our opinion, therefore has potential to be confusing to the public. Number 3, is the sign appearance compatible with the visual character of the surrounding area in scale, placement to the building, relationship of color to adjacent colors, dissimilarity of shape to other signs in the surrounding area, dissimilarity of lettering to other signs in the surrounding area. As noted above, sign is greatly out of scale with the intended character of 14 Mile Road. It's essentially a box sign, so it is not in any way unique in its shape. And in our opinion, it looks fairly odd in juxtaposition to the building. Number 4, is the sign legible from its intended location? We believe the sign would be legible from its intended location. Number 5, is the sign intended to be integrated into the character of the building as to the entrance and the architectural features? In our opinion, no. As noted above, it's out of scale with the building and is oddly placed in juxtaposition to the building. So the building on this site, as you can see in the photograph, is built right up to the right-of-way line of 14 Mile Road. It's similar in that way to like a downtown building. So normally what we see for signage in a downtown or with buildings that are built to what we call sometimes the build-to line or the right-of-way line is that because there is not a place typically on such a site for a freestanding sign, that wall signs are used to identify those sorts of properties. When Jim gets into giving his testimony later, he's going to explain to you that, in fact, this applicant has availed themselves of a bonus that's available in the sign ordinance in a situation where one cannot locate a monument sign on the site. So they've got bonus wall signage that they have erected pursuant to a permit that they got from his department to put up additional wall signage because they could not locate properly a freestanding sign on the site. And that would be consistent, in my view, with the placement of the building and what one would expect from a building that is situated on the site the way this one is. So we don't find that finding is met. Number 6, can the sign be viewed with comfort by pedestrians? In our opinion, no, it's out of scale for pedestrian activity. Number 7, if located on the ground, is the proposed sign outside the clear vision triangle? The sign is not located in the clear vision triangle. That's not an issue. Number 8, does the sign reflect the character of Clawson as opposed to emphasizing a national symbol? It appears to embody, as proposed, a national symbol, and as I discussed before, it's simply a box sign that contains a national symbol. Number 9, does the location of the sign obscure the store interior or its merchandise? No. Number 10, does the proposed sign significantly depart from the applicable provisions of the ordinance? The sign very significantly departs from the ordinance provisions. I've gone through that above, both in terms of allowable height and allowable area. It's approximately 3 times as high and over 3 times as large as would be allowed under the ordinance today. Number 11, if a projecting sign or guy wires or cables visible, it is not a projecting sign. That standard doesn't apply. Number 12, if illuminated, is the sign source hidden from view? Is glare sufficiently shielded? Is any electrical raceways exposed? Is the lighting compatible with surrounding light sources? We understand that the sign will be internally illuminated, and so that standard is not at issue. Number 13, such a variance may further be granted in those instances in which there has been a demonstrated showing by the applicant that the particular sign sought to be approved is suitable to the community or has some value that comports with the history and development of the community and would not, if a variance were granted, be materially in conflict with the applicable zoning regulations for the district in which the sign is located. As I've discussed here a few times, I find the sign to be materially in conflict with the freestanding signs that are allowed under the sign ordinance today. It is not unique or distinctive. It consists of nothing more than a box on 2 poles. In our opinion, that standard is not met. And finally, number 14, which is, in my view, the most significant of your findings as they relate to this particular request. If the signage proposed as the basis for the appeal does not result in the perpetuation of a sign that no longer conforms to existing sign regulations. In my opinion, that is exactly what the applicant is requesting to do. He has not proposed any modifications to the sign that would make it more conforming, and that standard does not appear to be met. I would remind you this is also a public hearing, so at some point during the process here you'll want to invite comments from the public as well. But those conclude my remarks on it, and I think the city attorney may have some other things that he wants to bring out with Jim.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to get some testimony in the record from Mr. Albus. Do you have your 4 sheets before you?
Yes, I do.
All right. Today you gave me 4 sheets of paper that are from your files in connection with this particular application. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And one is October 16th, 2017, from you to Mr. Bongiorno. I didn't pronounce that correctly, I'm sure.
Correct.
And what was the purpose of that letter?
They made an application. It's B&B Sign is Bob Bongiorno's company. They made an application to replace the existing signage on Phil Cavill's property with Pet Boys signage. And that was done on October 5th. I had subsequent denied the permit request and spoke with Bob. I believe it was only over the phone. I don't believe I met him at the front counter. And told him what our sign ordinances were and what could and couldn't be allowed. And once I came to that conclusion and spoke to him, we put together a formal denial letter. And I put together the 3 items of concern on that October 16th,
2017 letter.
Have they eventually applied for new signage on the building?
Yes, they resubmitted for new signage on the building,
When?
which is a permit number PB 170272. It was applied or issued a month later on 11/14/17. It was for the demolition of the pole sign and install 70 square feet of wall signage.
Did they indicate the location of the wall signage that was to be installed?
Yes, they did.
Where on the building?
On the front of the building, two smaller, or I believe one smaller box sign with the 50 square foot of signage on the front. And I believe the side had wheels, tires, some other over the bays was the remaining 20 square feet.
And would that be the east side of the building?
That would be the east side of the building.
Let me approach you a minute and show you the document that's been handed to us tonight, which is by the applicant, and I think it's tab 1 of it. It has a proposed signage of Pep Boys, is that right?
That was the original proposal that was denied.
All right. Do you see the proposed signage on the front, though?
Yes, I do.
And they are going to install similar color signage, but smaller on the front, is that correct? The front face of the building?
Yes, that actually after this permit was issued to demo the pole sign, install the 70 square foot of wall signage, the wall signage has been installed.
Do you know if it would be the same type of signage?
Uh,
Red, white letters? vivid red?
Similar, I can't tell per scale right now.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay. Nothing will be on the west side, is that correct?
nothing was proposed on the west side.
Okay. Thank you. Nothing further. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is John Mucha. I'm here on behalf of Pep Boys. And I have with me a number of other representatives for Pep Boys who also may be speaking this evening. If I may, I'd like to just introduce them to you. We have Bryant Brewer, who is corporate counsel, Jay Sporn, who is the area director, Bill Lockett, who is the president of SEMA Network Signage and Environmental Branding, Jim Callan, who is the store manager, and also Julie Kroll, who is with Fleece and Vanderbrink. She is a traffic safety engineer. Julie's right here. I've also presented to the members of the board a packet, which I think you all have in front of you, which contains our original notice of appeal, the supplement, which summarizes our arguments in slightly different fashion, the affidavit of Phil Cavill, a sign moratorium policy that's been adopted by the Clawson, correspondence from Julie Kroll, the traffic safety engineer, regarding safety concerns in the event the sign is removed. And then I've attached a number of photographs as well, which I think help illustrate some of the points that I'll be making here this evening. This property here has traditionally been the longtime location of Phil Cavill's Tire and Auto Service Center. There's not been any change in ownership of this property. Mr. Cavill continues to own the property. Pep Boys has leased this site just since last August of 2017. Same type of automotive and tire and automotive service center that was operated on the site for many, many years is still being operated on the property now by Pep Boys. There's been no change in the type of use of the property. Continues to provide the same services to the Clawson community as before. Pep Boys, and I think you'll hear in a moment from some of the others that are here, is very excited to be in Clawson. It's proud to carry on the hometown legacy of Phil Cavill. Jay Cullen, who is the store manager, will be able to speak to that issue in greater detail. The city has requested that Pep Boys remove this pole sign that has been there for decades, and suggested that Pep Boys apply for a variance if it wishes to keep the pole sign, which is what we have done. Pep Boys has already, and you'll hear from Bill Lockett in a little bit, Pep Boys has already removed considerable square footage of signage from this property from where it had been traditionally and historically. Is very concerned that the removal of the pole sign here would impair the visibility of the store, the entrance to the store, and that it would create traffic and safety concerns. We are requesting that that Pep Boys be allowed to retain the pole sign, obviously rebranded to say Pep Boys, rather than have the Goodyear moniker on there. The basis for this request is, as I've just mentioned, that there are significant practical difficulties for this property, which are unique to this property and which are best overcome by allowing the pole sign to remain. I do also want to touch base, before I go into the rest of this, I want to touch base a little bit on the height of the sign. One of the concerns here has been raised is height. Our concern is that if this pole sign is reduced in height at all, then the building itself becomes an obstacle to it being viewed from a distance. And this sign, unlike other pole signs in the area, is not obtrusive. It doesn't stick out in the middle it's not situated in the middle of a parking lot or standing alone by itself. It's very tight to this building, as you can see. And it is, the way it's been painted, the building is painted currently, it's virtually indistinguishable from the building. You don't really see the poles there at all. You just simply see the sign that's above the building. The sign is located above the building so as to present the necessary visibility to the building. Why do we have a pole sign? We have a pole sign there because there is absolutely, as you can see, absolutely no room whatsoever for a monument sign. This building is virtually on top of the sidewalk, and there's no place to locate a monument sign. You couldn't locate a monument sign on one side of the building or the other without the monument sign being completely unviewable from traffic on the opposite side of the building. So if we were to put a monument sign, for example, where the pole sign is currently located, what we would end up with is absolutely no visibility to eastbound traffic along 14 Mile Road of the location of this particular property until one were to get right on top of it. The building itself would obscure that pole sign. And so we believe that the pole sign itself is essential to the safety in this area and essential to having good visibility. We are not here to try to get something that we don't deserve. Pep Boys is here to try to get something that is essential to the continued economic viability of this business and also to the safety of its customers. We have heard from our insurers that the removal of this pole sign could dramatically increase risks to us and to the customers and liability to all concerned. I also want to just briefly touch on something that I've placed into the supplemental materials that we provided. And I don't want to dwell on it at all. We have presented a legal argument here, which I'm just placed in the materials for preservation in the record. Not as a means, I don't intend to discuss those legal arguments here this evening. I would much rather get right to the heart of the matter and talk further about the practical difficulties that necessitate the keeping of this pole sign. This property, of all the properties in Clawson, is probably one of the most unique in terms of the location of the building in relation to the sidewalk and the street. This is not a situation where the granting of a pole sign variance here is going to create a precedent for other properties or other owners. because you don't find other similar circumstances throughout Clawson. This is a unique property and a unique situation which calls for a unique solution. Unfortunately, there isn't any other good solution for visibility. And Bill Lockett will talk a little bit about wayfinding, but we also included in our materials the opinion of Julie Kroll, who is here with us tonight as well, which also talks about the need to have good wayfinding cues and the importance of this pole sign in that regard. So as you're driving along 14 Mile Road and you're headed east, you are not able to see this building in the summertime. And if you take a look at the first photograph that's in the packet, you'll see what I'm saying. The side of the building itself is obscured by the line of trees that are in front of the Advanced Auto Parts store. So as you're driving east, there is no good location for a sign on the side of that building, nor is one being requested by the city. The only place that we can really put this sign to be visible in a timely manner, so that it's visible well in advance of the motorist getting on top of the building itself, is to have it on the pole sign. We are very concerned that without having that advance notice of where the property is situated, and this is stated in the opinion of Julie Kroll, that you will have motorists that will either come to a very abrupt stop once they realize where the Pep Boys is located, and suddenly make a very sudden stop to get in the turn lane, or they may overshoot the location and then end up having to turn around and come back and re-enter traffic again in an unsafe manner. You'll hear from Jim Cullen here this evening, who will tell you that he has noted that people look to that Goodyear sign and they say, I'm driving down 14 Mile and I see a Goodyear sign here, but I don't see the Pep Boys sign. What does that tell us? It tells us that the front signage for this building, which now is 50 square feet, I think what you're seeing here are panels that are more than double. The old signage on the front of the building was more than double what currently is on the building for Pep Boys. But what it tells us is that the signage that's currently on the front of this building, directly facing 14 Mile, does not adequately alert motorists to the location in the same manner that a monument sign would ordinarily do, which is why monument signs are available to the businesses along 14 Mile in addition to the sign on the facade of their building. The sign on the facade itself is not sufficient to alert motorists in advance. Monument sign here is impractical. There's just frankly no place to put it that would be visible from both directions, and therefore this property has the kinds of practical difficulties that require the ZBA, we believe, or should cause the ZBA to find that a variance here is needed. We believe that these practical difficulties portend and may create safety issues, and that we would like to make sure that not only for purposes of our the store's economic health, but also for purposes of safety, that the pole sign be allowed to be retained. Now, there was some discussion here about the earlier application for the signage, and I have to say that, you know, it's regrettable that at the time the original application for signage was made, that the pole sign wasn't expressly requested to be retained. That was a mistake. And when upper management at Pep Boys recently discovered that this pole sign, the CEO lives in this area, the CEO for Pep Boys, and when he learned that this sign was one that the city was requesting be taken down, he was very, very concerned because he had a very strong personal relationship with Phil Cavill, understood the value of this sign to this store, the need to have it in order to retain the visibility, and also the fact that it references Mr. Cavill, which he found to be very, very important in terms of demonstrating to the community that Pep Boys was attempting to carry on the same kind of service and tradition that Phil Cavill had provided this community for many, many years. So there was a communication issue at the time. The original signage request should have been different than it was, and we are now here to try to correct that and go back and make sure that, if at all possible, that we could retain a pole sign at this location. I know that when you were here last month and Clawson Corners was before you, there was a concern about the practical difficulties presented at that location by the request for a monument sign. They wanted to keep their pole sign and were allowed to keep it. And they were allowed to keep it because the visibility of a monument sign at that location was going to be impaired by the wall that was directly in front of the shopping center. Here we have something even more significant than a wall. We have the building itself, and we have a line of trees. And so we have visibility that's significantly impaired for any sign that would, be facing east or facing west. And we have no room to put the monument sign. There's absolutely no physical space for that on this site. The significance of and this is not, I don't want to have the tail wag the dog here, but the Phil Cavill name on this sign is also very important to Pep Boys for reasons that I just explained, but also because I think there is a personal request here on the part of Mr. Cavill that there be something up there that recognizes his longstanding contributions and the fact that he operated this location for many years. Mr. Cavill could have selected any company to come in and lease from him here, but he chose Pep Boys. And Pep Boys is very proud of that fact. And Pep Boys wants to make sure that the community understands that it's here to try to carry on that hometown legacy that Mr. Cavill built. And for us, having that reference to him, whether it be in that form or in some other form, maybe it says in the tradition of Phil Cavill or something along those lines, but something that recognizes this was the long-time location of Phil Cavill's, we believe is important to Pep Boys and would also be a nice tribute by the community to him. We have an affidavit from him. I hope you have a chance to look at that. We have well, I think I've gone over all of these issues. So one other point I want to make here is I think I'd like to just have a little bit of rebuttal of a couple of the conclusions that were reached by Elliott. Yes, Mr. Elliott. So we have obviously in our own variance request gone through the 14 factors, and we've listed out our analysis of each of those factors, and they differ in several respects here. One of the concerns that was posed here was that this sign is much higher than the building, and I've addressed that already. You really can't reduce the height of that sign to any significant or appreciable degree. It's possible, I suppose, to reduce it slightly, but if you reduce it too much, then you end up not being able to see it because of the building itself. And so you run into the same problem that you would run into with a monument sign. That sign has to be elevated above the building in order to be visible from both directions. You can't reduce the sign of that or bring it down much lower without it its effectiveness being significantly diminished. I don't know how a sign tight to the building, as it is, inches from the building, can be confusing to the public. If it said Pep Boys there, how is that confusing to the public? It's right next to the building. It's not standing in front of some other building or standing in front of some other business. There is no public confusion that's going to result from the mere presence of that pole sign there. Whether this sign is out of scale or not, you know, I'll leave that to you, I suppose. We really need to have a pole sign, bottom line. If the pole sign is, and we would like to have the pole sign as is, if we can possibly do that. If in your judgment it needs to be scaled back in terms of the total square footage on the top of those poles, that would be something that we would be willing to consider. But that's not our formal request today, yet it is something that we could discuss here while we're at this hearing, if that is something you would like to do. So, do you want to take questions now, or should we have some additional people from Pep Boys make their presentations? How would you like to proceed?
Are there any questions at this point?
I have a question to clarify. The photo that's being presented here for the front footage, or the front signage that's facing 14 Mile, has been commented that it has been significantly reduced. And I just want to confirm with you that it's within the current ordinances, which is why it was permitted and it is now existing on the building, correct?
That's my understanding. Yes, that you don't have two large panels on the front. You have a single panel, which is 50 square feet. If you look at some of the photographs that I have in the packet that I presented to you, you'll see that on the side of the building, above the bay doors, and this is on the east side of the building, only visible to westbound traffic. There used to be a very large Goodyear sign, Goodyear logo sign, and then a circular tire and service network sign below that. Those have both been removed. And you now have just some white lettering there above that, which is, I'm not sure the square footage, 20 square foot or so. That just basically says that it's tire and auto. So a lot of this, the total square footage of the signage that had been on this building for years and years and years has been drastically reduced already. And taking down the pole sign on top of that and having no visibility to eastbound or westbound traffic, in our opinion, would create significant problems for the business and for the safety of the local community.
Thank you.
I do want to make one other point here, which is that there are numerous other pole signs in the area. And these pole signs are larger and we believe much more obtrusive than this Goodyear sign. You've got Del Taco, you've got Paul's Auto Wash, you've got Uncle Ed's Oil Shop, just to name a few. And those signs stick out like sore thumbs. This sign does not. It's tight to the building. It's integrated really fundamentally with the building. And it advertises the business at this building better than anything else that could possibly be there. There is no real good substitute or alternative for us, and that's why we're requesting the variance. If I may, I'd like to ask some of my colleagues here to elaborate on a couple of these points, if that's okay with the members of the board. Okay?
Sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jim Cowan. I'm the store manager. A lot of this stuff is over my pay grade, but I was basically brought into this store because the CEO for Pep Boys has kind of had a love for Clawson, and he decided that he wanted to get this building and continue on with the Phil Cavill legacy, and that's where I came into the picture. I was hired because I was born and raised in Clawson, both my parents born and raised in Clawson, and they wanted to keep up with that hometown Clawson feel that Clawson, as we know, the big city or the little city with a big heart. Right now, I've only been there about 2 months. Biggest thing that I've seen with the signage the way that it is right now is at least 2 to maybe 5 times, somewhere in there, a day I get a phone call from a customer saying, where are you guys at? I'm looking for Pep Boys, and all I see is this big Goodyear sign. Or, okay, where are you at? Oh, I'm in Advanced Auto Parts parking lot. I say, oh, we're where the Goodyear sign is. So unless you were somebody from Clawson that is known Phil Cavill's and the Goodyear sign, every day I get those phone calls of people they're blowing right past the building because they do not see where the 2 panels are on the front, where we now have the one. They do not see that Pep Boy sign until they've already went past it in either direction. So I think that, I started out at Phil Cavill's back in '84. Like I said, I've grown up in Clawson. Everybody kind of always knows where the big Goodyear sign is, but now that there's no Pep Boys logo out there, nobody knows. They just keep driving right past. And not really sure where else could put anything on there that would be visible for our customers. Basically, it's Clawson. That's part of Clawson. I mean, that sign has been there for forever, as long as I can remember. So I think it'd help out a lot with the Pep Boys logo in there instead of the Goodyear, and increase our business and stop all the confusion of the people calling all day long that can't find it. So that's all I got.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Bill Lockett. I'm with SEMA Network. We are the sign consultant for Pep Boys on a national level. We design, build, install signage for them for about 200 locations a year in communities all throughout the country. I just want to talk a minute about signage and the way we go about branding a location from a safety perspective, and also from a viability of business perspective. It's been a lot of talk about monument signs and pole signs. From a wayfinding perspective, we call it a freestanding sign, okay? And they will be either a monument or a pole sign. They both have distinctly different functions depending on the sort of property or situation. In this particular case, the city allows a monument sign only, which is low to the ground, and not a pole sign, which this currently is. But a freestanding sign needs to be visible and identifiable at an entrance point so that folks that are driving up and down the road, especially with a 2-lane highway, have adequate time to see the location, pull into a turning lane, and make a safe turn into the facility from either direction. As our attorney spoke about, we really don't have the ability to put a monument sign on this location. It's impossible. The location has a very, very unique circumstance in that the building is positioned virtually up to the sidewalk. So from a westbound perspective, without having any visibility on that side, it is very possible that people are going to just drive by the store. I know the code referenced that sort of with technology being where it is today, that maybe people kind of know where you're at, and therefore there's less of a need for signage, which to a degree I agree with. However, I think the manager's point that there is a sign on the front and people are Googling and saying, oh, the new Pep Boys is at this location, but yet they're driving past it because they can't see a Pep Boys sign. And we believe that this sign, as currently positioned, I think in the original design and ordinance, they got it right. With this building being set back the way it is, this is really your only true visibility to safely pull into this parking lot at this particular location because of the unique circumstance. As the attorney spoke, I do want to talk a little bit about the planner's comments in terms of height and size. He mentioned that this is 3 times the allowable monument height and maybe 3 times the size of the allowable square footage for the sign itself. I just want to point out that the sign is higher than the building because it has to be visible from the westbound side. If you're in a car, I want you to just picture and think about driving up that road. You're in a car, you're looking up. That sign has to be that far above the building in order to have a visual line of sight above the building and to see the sign in order to turn into the turning lane and make that left. If we were to take that sign down and even go with the one other bonus sign, because we can't physically put a monument sign on this location, that would be put on the east side elevation. There's still nothing on the west side elevation. You're going to have people blowing past this sign, stopping abruptly to make a left, or coming the other way, seeing it, turning into advance. And I think I spent a half an hour just watching traffic at rush hour. I think it's a very dangerous circumstance if people get into the adjacent location and they have to quickly get out of there, turn into the turning lane, and stop and turn into the Pep Boys location. You have a potentially chaotic situation on your hands. I think when you think about the overall square footage, the height being 3 times, visually, the higher you go, the larger the sign needs to be just to be able to have the same relationship. So I don't really agree with the fact that it appears to be out of scale. I think it's necessary for the height. The scale is necessary for the height, and the height is necessary for the visibility and safety. I really believe they're one and the same from my experience. I also want to point out that there is a freestanding sign just several buildings down at the Del Taco. Same cabinet sign, similar pole sign, similar sales scale, similar square footage, and that particular building is set back further, which doesn't have the same practical difficulties that we have here for Pep Boys. So I really would like the board to really take into consideration the safety. You're all familiar with the community more so than me. Visualize yourself coming from the westbound side with no sign and the potential liability that has. I do probably 25 variance hearings a year, and I think the board was very specific that they want to regulate pole signs out of this community. It's very clear. And I understand that the board doesn't want to set a precedence to have company after company come in and by right, because somebody else had a variance, have one. This site is extremely unique. I don't think the board is in a position where they would have to grant somebody else, because you see very few circumstances where the building is up against the sidewalk unless you're in a downtown area. If you're in a downtown area, such as Main Street, you maybe have one lane with traffic running much slower. So the need to have the freestanding sign is completely different. It's truly a different circumstance altogether. From our professional experience, we think what we're asking for is really the minimum available signage to safely and properly navigate this location for Pep Boys and for the community. We would also like the board to take into consideration, in the spirit of the code, part of it says to reduce clutter and reduce signage as part of the go-forward plan of the community. I would really like the board to take into consideration that what you see here is approximately 350 square foot of signs. If the board were kind enough to grant us the variance for the freestanding sign with Phil Cavelli, we're still almost half of the square footage that was on this building for many, many, many years. The planner talked about the sign being a concern and confusing to the public. I can't understand that, because that sign has been existing for a long time. I don't think anybody has approached the community, the store, and said, this sign is confusing to me. In fact, I think it's safely navigated people to and from the store to build a vibrant business for Mr. Cavelli for some years. But again, I would like the board to take into consideration that Pep Boys, as a trusted partner in the community, has greatly reduced the signage on the building, but again, to a point where they can get people to safely and properly navigate the location without any potential liability for any stakeholder involved. That's just my presentation. If you have any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Lockett?
Oh, thank you for your input.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you mind if I ask Ms. Kroll to
Sure.
ask us some questions about it? Could you come up, please? And I'm familiar with her employer. It happens to be a general contractor of the Water Authority I represent up north, so she's with a good company.
I like to think so.
Absolutely. This report of yours is dated the
Yes, sir.
17th, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Did you prepare it the day before?
No.
When were you retained on this?
It's a good question. What is today?
Today's the 18th.
Today is Thursday, the 18th.
Yes.
I was retained on Tuesday.
Okay, Tuesday, 16th.
Yep.
Okay,
So I wrote this yesterday.
all right, good enough. And,
I also went out there yesterday, too.
yeah, I was going to ask you.
It was a
you-
nice sunny day.
You've been out there once, right?
I have been out there once.
How long were you there?
I was about there a half hour.
Okay. Did you look at these photographs at all?
Those are from Google Earth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you take them, or were you presented with these?
Can I see this photo?
Yeah, sure.
This appears like the screenshot from the street view from Google Earth.
All right. But
I have seen that.
This street view
Yes,
is on the northern side of the street, isn't it?
correct.
And if you came from the southern, if we're taking over here.
Yep. It was
The
taken.
facing up here would be a little more apparent, wouldn't it?
So this was actually, the Google Street View was from April 2017, I believe, if I looked at the date correctly. And you can see, well, this one says August 12th,
Right.
2012. But
But if you were
on the other side, yes.
going down. it
There's
would be-
there's another one where the trees were larger.
I understand.
Yes.
But
So it
why-
depends on the time of year.
Time of year, and it also depends on the direction where you're located in the street, going east, doesn't it?
Yeah, so I believe this is,
Right, this is east,
Mm-hmm.
and so if you're over on the far southern lanes, this would be more visible.
the side of the
The
building.
side, no, the front of that's the front of
The
the
front
building.
of the front of the building is actually really hard to see, and I did notice that.
All
Not
right.
not being from Clawson, as if I were to go to Pet Boys, I'd put it in my GPS, and it would send me and it would get me approximately there. And what I had a tendency to do is I did see the sign, but I was already up on the building because the sign it's not super big, and they don't have two signs; they just have one now.
All right, but you didn't have any trouble turning around and going back, did you?
I did. It was very
Really? How
difficult.
crowded was it?
It was very busy, and it was midday. I went
time
at
of day?
lunchtime.
Lunchtime?
I did. I went at lunchtime. It was about 12:30.
Which driveway did you go into?
I didn't even make it in that driveway. I had to turn down. There's a vacant building down the street,
Okay.
and there was actually a lot of people that had turned around there because I could see in the snow where the tracks were, where people had been turning around because they'd missed their buildings.
All right. Let me ask you the question, though. Have you seen their signage, what it's like? Certainly.
The existing signage?
No, this signage. Pep Boys. Very vivid, isn't it?
Yes.
Red and white
Yes.
lettering. And if the signage were, if we saw a variance for signage on the front of the building, similar to that on the front, on that, it'd be more visible from either direction further away, wouldn't it?
Which signage are you speaking of? The
On
pole
the face of
sign?
the building, on the face of the
They have
building.
that. That sign's there now.
It's not 100 square feet, though.
The sign
It's
that they have
smaller.
now.
It's less. I'm saying if it were that size on the front of the building.
I can't speak to that. I can't speak to that.
Well-
That would be your sign expert that just spoke.
Okay, you're not a
That's-
sign expert?
I'm the traffic and safety expert, so I can tell you if you don't have adequate signage, what will happen to your.
Have you testified in cases before about signage which is inadequate?
Have I testified?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Have you testified in situations where signage is adequate or appropriate for a building?
No, generally, what we do is provide our expertise in traffic and safety in
And,
regards to signage.
right, and to the potential of accidents occurring and
Correct.
so forth.
Yep.
But you weren't able to determine any of those facts or circumstances, particularly in this situation, the half hour you were there, other than concluding there could be a safety problem.
Correct. So we do that, we look at crash potential. And that's actually something we do quite frequently for MDOT. They do road safety audits where we look at crash potential based on existing conditions.
That's exactly correct. And when you do it for MDOT, you spend more than a half an hour on the project. coming
Depends
up
on
with
the
your
project.
But generally, you spend more than a half an hour, isn't
For
that
this,
correct?
for this site, we'd spend a half an hour.
Okay.
Depends on the length of the site.
Well, tell me the one most recently that you did for MDOT.
The last
That
one
was
I,
the same period of time.
the last project I did for MDOT that was similar was a mile-long segment, and it took us 2 hours.
All right. And were signs involved in that?
Yes, sir.
Where was the location?
Heartland, M59.
Okay. Have you ever concluded that pole signs can be a detriment of that height?
I don't know how a pole sign could be a detriment to
Okay.
traffic and safety.
Okay, good enough. But also, you are aware of the fact that signage on the front of the building can also be visible from distances, if it's a higher, more in size, color, so forth. In other words, that can attract customers to the building rather than a pole sign.
As far as the visibility of the sign from the driver's eye, I would
Right.
leave that to the sign expert.
Okay, very good, thanks.
Any other questions about traffic and safety? And
Am I able to,
Sure.
to cross here at all?
Oh my God, I don't know what's going on here. This is the craziest ZBA I've ever been to.
I have a question.
Sure.
about the traffic and safety, because you said that your issue was you drove by it because, why? You said you plugged it into Google and you
I
didn't see it.
did.
And
I
you-
did. So I plugged it into Google, and I was looking for the Goodyear sign because I knew what it had looked like because I'd seen it from Street View and I had looked at it. So I saw it, and I was trying, and I drove past several times, and so then I came around and I turned back, and then I came back going eastbound on 14 Mile, and I was like, what if this sign wasn't here? What if this sign was on the side of the building? Because right now you can see it because there's no foliage on those trees. And I would have thought, oh, I need to turn into the Advanced Auto Parts.
So you didn't pass the sign, you didn't pass the building accidentally because you missed it altogether or whatever. You were deliberately, you knew it said Goodyear, and you were looking from the perspective of what if it, from that.
If I had missed, yes.
Because the way you said it, I was getting the impression that you literally missed it.
I didn't literally miss it because I had looked at it at Street
You
View.
knew what you were doing.
I
You
do
knew it
know,
said
I
Goodyear.
did.
You
But I'm
just-
trying, correct. I'm
Okay,
trying to
and
put
that's fine.
myself
I just
in
want to
the.
be clear, because it sounded like you said you literally missed it instead of, and I was a little confused, because I thought, well, I would hope she would know she was looking.
No, I did know I was looking for it, but there was actually a lot of congestion through there, even at lunchtime, trying to get in the left turn
understand. I
lane.
live here.
It was a lot of jockeying for position, because there is a lot of driveways through there. It's very dense, and there's a lot of driveways along 14 Mile. So if I had thought that if the sign was on the other side of the building, I thought, oh, must turn here, because the building's here, and turn into the Advanced Auto Parts, thinking that the driveways are connected in the back. So I drove around the back, and then they weren't connected in the back.
And if
it
you were
it
looking
spit
for
me out.
Advanced Auto Parts, would you have missed that?
The sign, Advanced Auto Parts was easier to see than the AutoZone sign, which was much smaller on a monument sign. That was difficult to see.
So you don't have a safety issue with the Advanced Auto Parts sign?
No, we weren't asked to evaluate the Advanced Auto Parts sign.
But you're the expert, and you got a picture, and you drove by it 17 times, so did you have a problem with the
I
Advanced
did
Auto?
not have any problem with the Advanced Auto Parts sign.
Just check, okay. From a safety perspective, not a,
No,
That's
and
what
I
I'm
didn't
asking. Okay.
evaluate, sight distance or anything else evaluate with the Advanced Auto Parts sign, because I wasn't tasked with that.
all right. That's all I had.
You're gonna cross-examine me?
Just a
ZBA?
couple quick
Okay,
questions. I mean, sorry.
sure.
So, in your professional opinion, will the visibility of the building improve or worsen as these trees to the west of the building mature?
Well, as they continue to mature and during the summer months, absolutely, it will block that side of the building. I think that was the intent in doing those trees, is to provide street trees and foliage and some camouflaging.
In your professional opinion, is the current sign on the facade of the building sufficient to alert the average motorist to the location of the building and the entrance to the building?
Which sign are you speaking? The front?
Facade,
The front?
Just the front
the existing red sign, I didn't even get to read it. It was small print, and I drove by, and it was fast, and I didn't even have an opportunity to, I saw that it was Pep Boys just based on the logo.
In your professional opinion, does the pole sign provide adequate and sufficient notice to the average motorist as to the location of this building?
Yes, because I was looking for the Goodyear sign, so when I came up, it's Coolidge, right? It's Crooks. 14 Mile,
This is
14 Mile and Crooks.
Crooks, correct.
Came up Crooks, and I turned right, and I was looking for that Goodyear sign, and as I'm like, okay, I'm looking for the sign, because I know it's here, and I turned the corner, and I could clearly see it as I was coming off of, on 14 Mile. It was very, very easy to see. So I did see the sign, I just deliberately drove past as if that wasn't there. How would I know which driveway to turn into? And what I thought was also helpful was that the poles kind of indicated you could, as I was just getting to the driveway, I'm like, oh, well, this is where the driveway is, because I could see where the sign came down to the ground. So otherwise, that was how I was confused a little bit by the advanced auto parts. So it's like I could see how somebody could turn in there. And I believe you said that people do turn in to the advanced auto parts.
Thank you.
Just one thing, and it's not I'm going to echo John's comments about legal arguments, but he did cite a case, Tull, for the proposition that you cannot violate a moratorium on large signs. We aren't doing that in this case. There's an ability to retain enough advertising on this, but the key thing is that cities do have the right, regarding pole signs, to enter moratoriums and have their eventual removal. The Tull case cited referred to a case under the Zoning Enabling Act. The regulation and the right of municipalities to govern signage comes under the Home Rule Act, which is an entirely different act. And as a result, there are a number of cases that cite that municipalities have the right to regulate the size of signs as well as their eventual removal on a moratorium basis. So that's just clarification for the record. And I will give the case just for the record on this case. And I've given you a memo also of 3 cases, one of which was the city of Clawson dealing with billboards. And Clawson prevailed in that with the notation that they'd have the right to regulate the size of signage. That's what this is really all about. Yeah.
Just the Clawson sign moratorium policy, it's part of the materials, it's already part of the record here, and I don't want to belabor this point because I'm not here to talk legal theory. We're here to talk about the practical difficulties that we believe require retaining of the pole sign here at this particular store. But the policy here says, no effort will be made to replace or remove them until such time as a change in ownership or use occurs or the occupancy of the property becomes vacant. So policy's there, Pep Boys comes to the property, this is the policy. No change in ownership, Phil Cavill owns the property. No change in use occurs, still in the same use category. This is still, we're not going from retail to industrial or residential. It's still the same use category under the use provisions of your zoning ordinance. And that property did not become vacant. So there's an expectation here that this moratorium is going to be in place, and then there's not going to be any demand for the removal of this pole sign. And I believe that moratorium should be honored. It's a matter of good faith, not just a question of whether the city of Clawson has the power to ignore it, but whether they ought to ignore it. And I think that in all fairness, Pep Boys is here trying to make sure that this store is adequately marked invisible to its motorists. Not here to try to debate whether the city of Clawson has the power to make it more difficult to do business here. So that's why we'd like to keep the pole sign if we could.
I have a question or two. Is this a co-branded effort between Pep Boys and Phil Cavill? Or is this just a nod to Phil?
It's really more of a nod to Phil. Phil owns the property. I think he's indicated to us, and certainly his affidavit indicates that he would very much like to see this remain on his property. He believes that if this sign is removed, it may lessen the value of his property over time. And that having the name there is really, I think there's a little bit of a pride in that on his part. And that's what it seems to indicate in his affidavit. And we certainly like the Pep Boys likes the bounce that it gets because, there has been an attempt here to retain some of the hometown flavor and to try to carry on in the tradition of Phil Cavill.
But the reference to Phil Cavill could be placed elsewhere, correct? I mean, it doesn't have to be on that sign?
Okay, well, I'm not really sure. That's not a decision that I would make.
I'm asking.
Okay.
Go ahead. Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm the area director. I spoke to Phil Cavill when we purchased the location, and he wanted us to take basically the whole family. The whole staffing there and everything is what Phil had. Chet Settles has been there for many years. Randy's been there for what? How many years has Randy been working there? 36 years. The whole package was we wanted his business. He wanted us to move on with it, and just the town knows everybody. They walk in there, is Chet here, is Randy here? I mean, people, when I go in there, everybody was very concerned. They saw the blue shirt and everything like that. Who are you? We heard that you guys were taking over because Phil was retiring. So basically, I kind of feel that we are it is like a handshake of please don't ruin my business. I worked hard. The guy was coming in every single day, like, please don't ruin this, don't break this, please take care of this business for me. Mm-hmm. And all the people that come in from that town, they look at me, they're like, hey, thank you, thank you, thank you. Is everybody still here? Yes. So, that sign basically is like a mark of Phil. And to see it disappear, that kind of upsets me because I want to go in there and run a successful business for the community and everything, give the community what they need. That's why, the CEO was like, I want somebody from Clawson to run that store because I guess the previous manager there is now recovering from cancer. What was his name? Al. Everybody knows Al, I guess. I want to bring him back to that business. So I brought somebody in, part of the community, and luckily he answered my ad. And I got him in there, and everybody knows him. I mean, you guys know him, right?
So wait, you're saying it's nostalgic, and that's great, but what you're also saying is that you made a sound business decision to retain the staff that was there before because that would keep your business strong moving forward. That's not necessarily a requirement that Phil's, you're making it sound like this was a favor to Phil, and it sounds to me like it was a sound business decision.
It's a smart business. It's the right thing to do.
Okay, so
it's a co-branded effort is what I'm getting at.
That's what I'm.
May I ask a question? And I don't know who would have the authority or the wherewithal to answer it. However, the area manager just stood up and said you purchased the lot. Previously, it said it was leased.
Well, leased, that's what I mean.
My question is this a lease to purchase, therefore inferring a change in ownership?
Can you respond to that, their point about the moratorium?
If I said anything illegal,
No, I'm just wondering, we're talking about a moratorium and you're saying there is no change in ownership, but there's been a discrepancy and I feel that we must address it.
It's not. This is Bryant Brewer. Thank you for having us this evening. I'm corporate counsel for Pep Boys, and we are leasing the premises. It's not a lease to own or a lease to buy. We entered into a lease with Phil Cavill and are paying him as a result of entering into that lease.
Thank you.
How long is the lease? Excuse me. How long is the lease term?
I can't speak to the specifics of that, but I can get that information for you and have it sent to you.
I have another question, too. There's been a lot of talk about sort of the historical or nostalgic sensibility about what, to me, is the Goodyear sign. So do you believe that that nostalgia would be lost when the Pep Boys sign goes up? I mean, isn't the nostalgia for the Goodyear sign?
We are a Goodyear dealership.
Excuse me, could you please step up to the mic?
We do sell Goodyear tires. So that helps, with the customers coming in, they see the Goodyear tires and everything.
But the Pep Boys sign wouldn't be so familiar to people in a
Well,
nostalgic manner?
when Phil retired, he sent out a letter that he was retiring. And basically, everybody knows, that Pep Boys took over. So he wrote a letter to all of his customers and all of his businesses that he was dealing with.
Okay, thanks.
Are you about to say something?
Green light goes on, I will. So, I mean, I think as we were discussing earlier, about the confusion, I think it's important to remember that right now, the situation that prevails is that you've got a Goodyear sign there when people are looking for Pep Boys, right? So it might be far less confusing if it were gone. We have other businesses along this stretch of road that have gone through site plan review recently with Planning Commission that are similarly situated, that sit out at or close to the right-of-way line, Noble Appliance, Haberman Fabrics. Both of them have chosen to forego ground monument sign in lieu of the additional wall signage that you get for doing that, even though they had a place on their site where they could have had a monument sign. Apparently, they thought it was adequate to have signage on the front of the building that would sufficiently identify their businesses, which are in fact local businesses as opposed to nationally recognized businesses like this one is. It didn't really come out in the discussion with the traffic engineer, but I think in the first of those pictures, if you look at it, you're sitting at a point west of the site. You're not even in a travel lane. You're on the north side of the right-of-way, and you from that angle can see the front of this building pretty clearly. If you were over on the south side of the road, where you would be traveling if you're heading eastbound, approaching this site, for sure you can see the front of this building without any trouble. And the thing what I meant by this juxtaposition of the sign of the building is potentially confusing is that you're looking at a sign that is above the building and trying to determine then, you get a building in front of it and then you can see this sign. Well, where is that sign really in relationship to the property that you're looking for? The way it sits there is really like a roof sign, and a roof sign is a prohibited sign in Clawson. And so, it just seems to me, and I deal with signs a lot, that it's far less confusing for this site to not have that sign there.
Can I ask a question? One of the factors that would play into this, and one of the things that keeps coming up, is whether there's an alternative or a viable alternative to meet what they're trying to get, people from all sides, whatever. So, and I know we're only asking for a reuse, and that's what the question in front of us, but to understand if they meet any of those exceptions, is there any spot, so for example, where they have that board right there, it's not a parking spot. I went and drove by, and the picture shows it's got yellow lines crossing it out. So I don't know who owns that part of the lot. Is that a viable spot for a monument sign? Right, you see where I'm talking about? Right next to the red car? I mean, I'm trying to understand if that's one of the arguments.
I'll answer that.
Thank you.
The sandwich board sign where she's describing, that is in the corner clearance. So if we put a ground monument sign there, a car pulling out of the parking lot would not see a kid on a bicycle or that.
Okay, so that messes
it's
our triangle
prohibited.
of safety thing, or
Yeah.
okay, so one
Similar
can't. So
situation
is there
to-
any place, that's my question, because that's one of the things that's supposed to be something that we factor. Is there, and a sandwich board, by the way, to me, because I know that's come up before, is an alternative. That can be placed, it comes in every night, but it can be placed. So is there any alternative? Because that's one of the things they keep trying to say, is that there isn't an alternative.
Well,
for people.
there's a number of alternatives. They've already availed themselves of one of them, which is their bonus wall signage that they're entitled to. An alternative variance request would be for additional wall signage.
Like on that east wall, right, or that east part of the roof
Correct.
right there?
Correct.
And then what about the west side?
Again, that's a variance that could be requested. They're suggesting that you can't see it because of the neighbor's trees. I think you have to consider, what if everybody had a sign like this? What would you then see?
I just want to factor in that when I'm thinking about this. 'Cause-
In terms of the corner clear vision area, we had a situation similar to that down the street at the mobile gas station, and they applied for a variance for that reason. And what their sign was 12 feet high. It started 8 feet above the ground, which is then outside of the corner clear vision area, and went 32 square feet. It was conforming an area, 32 square feet above the 8 feet off the ground, in order to avoid being an obstruction within that corner clear vision area. And so the triangle, would be a place where a sign like that could be constructed, though a variance would be needed to
But there
not
are
create
other
a-
options.
Sure, of course there are.
Could you come to the mic, please?
The question started off with were there alternatives in terms of a freestanding sign being available.
It started there, but I also said board, sandwich board, that's not, that's movable. I'm looking for any options. I'm just trying to.
Understand. I just wanted to be clear that there wasn't another available location for a freestanding sign.
Okay.
And that the availability on the west elevation is just not going to be visible. And architecturally, that mansard roof is only on two sides of the building. It comes down further and has the gutter system and downspouts. So not only is it not visible, it wouldn't be aesthetically pleasing and serve the purpose that we need to get people safely. We really did investigate all opportunities, and I must stress to the board, we felt this was the best and minimal alternative to safely and adequately navigate, people, especially motorists. What's your name, sir? I'm sorry.
Right, Elliot.
Greg Elliott mentioned that you can see the front sign from a certain vantage point. That sign runs parallel to 14 Mile Road. Motorists, which is really our key audience here for safety, they look for the freestanding sign that runs perpendicular to the road. In absence of that, again, I really would like to make clear that I think we have some potential liabilities and chaos, because that's not adequate enough to see, turn, and navigate into the facility. I just wanted to point that out. Thank you.
Could I just ask Bill a question or two here, just for the record, if I may?
Sure.
Bill, how long have you been involved with this particular site?
Could you please
Okay.
step up to the mic?
Sorry. John Mucha on behalf of Pep Boys. Bill, how long have you been involved with this particular site?
Oh, goodness. Approximately since September, perhaps.
And how much time have you spent investigating this site and looking at the characteristics and features of it?
Hours upon hours. I haven't tracked my time, but I don't think any shortage of 20 hours between our branding team, our design team.
Have you heard any testimony here today from anyone that would suggest that the west side of this building is visible, especially in the summer months when the trees are in full foliage?
I have not.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions?
I do have a big question. I appreciate all of the discussion. I appreciate that there's this large package, but that leads me to confusion, as in, what's in this package, is it a complete supplement to the things that were published for us to review prior to this meeting? Or is it a replacement in all or in part? And that's the first question. I want to be able to understand that.
I assume you're referring to the multi-page, this one that I'm
Yes, sir.
holding up? That's one that was just presented tonight, and it is deemed to be a supplement to the record. So, I mean, if you need time to review that, then you're justified in making that request and deferring the decision, if it's significant to your decision. It is hard to gather information when you get a document like that on the eve or on the day of the hearing.
I think if you look at it, 1 and 2 were in your packet. 3 was provided to you after the packets went out by email. 4, is our record. That's our policy. 5 and 6 are new tonight.
And is 4 confirmed as our active city policy for moratorium on these pole signs?
I think Jim's best suited to answer that, but that is the one we operate from.
That's the one we've been operating under since 2014.
Okay.
Except for the instances where we have gone on variances, or the parties have negotiated to remove the sign as they redevelop the property.
So as I understand it, there is no redevelopment of this property.
No.
And there is no change in ownership because it is a current lease from Phil Cavill to Pep Boys.
Well, it's a change in ownership of the business, but I should point out that we're not here tonight to interpret the city council's moratorium, right?
Well,
We're
I
here.
kind of am,
we're
because
here
I'm
to-
wondering why we even need a variance if there's no change in ownership.
Well, because staff has denied them a permit to reface this sign. Staff has determined that there is a change in ownership as contemplated by that policy. The business has changed ownership. You did not hear tonight how long the term of the lease is. My suspicion is that it's quite a long-term lease.
Okay, thank you.
So given, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to make a motion to present one finding of fact for us to agree or disagree on, because it might be a way to get a little bit farther from that.
Before you do that, you might want to invite comments from the public, because we haven't really had the public hearing yet.
Oh, all right, then the other motion after the public hearing is I'd like 10 minutes to look at section 5 and 6, because I didn't look at them while I was listening. I tried not to, at least. So I'd like to look at that to see if it's consistent with what we think is, this is as an addendum, and that there's not something in there that we should look at prior to further discussion.
Okay. Jim, I have one question for you. Should I close the public hearing if members still have questions for folks in the audience?
You can close the public hearing, and it's entirely proper, though, after the review, if you have questions, to address them individually and have them come to Mike and explain it, be on the record.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay. Is there anybody else in the audience wishing to speak tonight on this matter? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing at 8:55. So, Ed, do you want to finish your question or comment?
I'd like to ask the board to take a maximum of 10-minute recess so that I can take a look at specifically 5 and 6 that we're not able to look at during the discussion, and then come back. It may not take that long.
Okay. Is anybody opposed to that?
No. I agree.
We're going to take a 10-minute recess. We'll reconvene at 9:05.
Thanks.
one of our ex-mayors passed away.
I hope you can find it with their signage. So why couldn't they put one right here?
That's what he explained, that's the triangle of vision.
Look how
Because it's
close.
set back, Phil. There's a little median of ground.
You can ask again to explain. but
You'd
that's-
have to bump it up like the mobile sign.
Yeah, that's what he said.
That's okay.
Well, then, for the record, did anybody hear that our Mayor Palmer passed away? Our old Mayor Palmer?
No.
He did. Recently.
May he
Record
rest
that?
in peace.
Yes.
It's 9:05. I'll call the Board of Zoning Appeals meeting back to order. So are there any questions from the board?
Sorry, I guess just the question that I have, or just a clarification about the historical value, which I think would go away once this sign was rebranded. So, and among the many hours everybody's thought of, the conclusion is that repurposing the existing sign is the only alternative. I know you had mentioned that you might be willing to, revisit making it smaller, making it shorter. So that's my question. I mean, it seems to be an option. In other words, the only option that we have at this point is to repurpose the existing sign. That's the question that's being asked.
That's all they've applied for. That's the variance request that's in front of you.
I think that's correct. We would be willing to revisit the dimensions of that so long as they remain on the pole. We just don't see another place to put a sign that's visible to east and westbound traffic.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, if that sign needs to be reduced in width to some extent, then that's an option.
Thanks.
Madam Chair, I'd like to propose that we come to a consensus in our team of some findings of fact so that we can agree on those statements of fact, and then use that to support the eventual motion.
Sure.
There's been a lot of discussion. The findings of fact, I think, have been slightly reassessed in my understanding from the going through the 14 points. And I'm going to, in this discussion, at least from my perspective, stick to the 14 points because those were from our zoning ordinance, the things that were listed that are the main things that we have to consider. If we add some others from the board, that's fine. We've done that from before. So I think I'd like to go back through the 14 points, finding of fact. Number one, I think I propose that we agree that the proposed sign represents the business that's intended to be enhanced by the fact that the proposal is to replace the current Goodyear sign with the Pep Boys sign in the same square footage and height location. So it does represent Pep Boys. And number two is the sign appropriate so it doesn't cause confusion or mislead the public. As a Pep Boys sign for that proposal, I do not believe that it would mislead or cause confusion to the public. Is a sign comparable to in the buildings in number 3 here? It is a sign that is not in character with the intent of the zoning ordinance, so it's not really with the visual character, and there's nothing unique about it. It's a pole sign with a rectangular sign area.
May I add something to that, too? Just to say that, the color scheme in the existing sign is fairly subdued, and I would think that with the color scheme, the branding of Pep Boys in that same spot would make it look even more out of scale, because it would be giant, bright red, just to make that point.
I agree. So if we can just keep that, add that on. The proposed sign would be legible, number 5. Sign integrated into the character of the vehicle. I would agree that the answer is no. It's close to the building and it's high above. It's almost a roof sign, although it is a freestanding sign. So the answer is not really, no. Can the sign be viewed from customer by pedestrians? If you're far enough away, yes. If you're close, no, because you're looking up. We already agree that the sign is not located in the vehicle entrance in the clear vision triangle, so that's good. The sign doesn't represent anything unique to Clawson. The Pep Boys sign is a national business symbol. The sign does not exterior the interior or the merchandise, so the answer to number 9 is no. Number 10, the sign does depart substantially from the ordinance provisions. It is 3 times as high and 3 times as large as what a monument sign would be allowed. Number 11, it is not a projecting sign. Number 12, we understand that it would be illuminated internally. That's not an issue. Number 13, in all of this discussion, we are not talking about the portion of any signage that says anything in reference to the previous owner-operator, Mr. Phil Cavell. I think that would need to be taken up in an entirely different manner. And so there's not really anything of historical development of the community that would necessitate retaining this sign. And number 14, yes, this does, in the height and the square footage, because we are just replacing the current sign with the Pep Boy sign, it does perpetuate a sign that no longer conforms to the existing regulations.
Do you need a motion to accept those findings of fact?
No, I want to go on, I think, and then I appreciate any comments on that. I did go to the point that the public confusion, if it was Pep Boys, there's no. And we agree at this point in time, based upon what we know from today, that there is no presented practical location for a monument sign on this site. That's what we know of today.
Which of those points did those go under?
I think it's just a clarification in the findings. It's a finding of fact in my assessment that we've gone through the scenario, and we would agree that from what we've been presented so far, there's no proposal for a monument sign that would be acceptable. I also think that it is appropriate to look at this variance from the perspective that they are changing the use of the sign.
Right.
In that it is going from what was there, the Goodyear sign, to the Pep Boy sign. So from that perspective, it's a critical finding of fact that the verbiage and the intent of the business and the sign that we're talking about changes from one type to another, from Goodyear to Pep Boys.
And can I just further clarify that it was deemed by city staff that because it was a longer-term lease, it was a change of ownership of the business, not necessarily the real estate, but a change of ownership of the business.
I would think that would, maybe we ought to make that a separate statement to make certain that we don't conglomerate with the rest
The
of
length of
it.
that lease, we assume it's a long-term, but they didn't have an answer for us.
Mhm.
So we don't have evidence to the length of that lease. Go for it.
You have
If I may interrupt, during the break, we were able to learn that it is a 10-year lease.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I had to change whatever I just said. I take it back. We now know.
So is it agreed then that?
So then we agree that for going from the Phil Cavell service use that we aren't taking the type of use, but we are changing the use, at least for a 10-year lease, from the Phil Cavell to the Pep Boys, I guess you'd call it the sign information.
Well, it's the brand, it's a different
brand.
brand altogether. I mean,
Does
the lease,
that agree with your intent statement?
Well, I do think it needs to be stated separately that it was agreed that it was a change of ownership of the business. That's what was precipitating this review, because it was it's.
We agree with the finding of the City Building Department Administration that this review was correct because the 10-year lease is effectively a change of ownership
Of the business,
of the business.
yes.
I would agree to that.
Okay. You guys have any comments?
I would not agree to that, because as my understanding, a zoning variance goes with the land, not the use or type of business. Correct me if I'm right or wrong.
That is true, but that's not the question that's before the board. The question is in terms of the interpretation of the council's moratorium policy. And, as I
Well,
said
as a
before, I'm not,
Judicial, body of the city, it is my wherewithal to interpret the ordinance as it's listed and therefore deem whether or not a variance is necessary. It has been requested, but I still question why. If we're following a moratorium that was adopted by our council, why, as a zoning board, would we backtrack what they've adopted?
so what is in the ordinance? Is a requirement that this sign was to have been removed by December 31st, 2014. The city has a policy, it's not an ordinance, it's not a law, that it enforces that under those circumstances that are described in the moratorium. The staff has interpreted that policy and has denied them the request to alter this sign. What they've come to you with is not not a request to challenge that interpretation, but rather a request for a variance to perpetuate the non-conforming sign.
So can you say that again to make sure I'm crystal clear?
Probably never again.
As of December 31st, 2014, the ordinance says that all the signs were to come down.
That all non-conforming signs in the city were to have been removed.
Okay. And now what you're saying is that what we were looking at is a policy, not the ordinance.
Correct. It's a policy on enforcing the ordinance. So it's, if you will, prioritizing when enforcement should take place, under what circumstances. Those circumstances where those things that are described in the policy have happened. The council decided that they did not want to impose on those who were not doing anything different with their property the obligation to take down an existing functional sign. It did not envision changes to those signs. Keep in mind that besides requesting to keep it, in general, with respect to nonconformities, one should not alter them. So, they're asking to alter the sign in a way that the policy really, as it's written, does not contemplate. What the moratorium policy contemplates is that if you're not doing anything to your sign, then we're not going to go out and proactively make you take that sign down. But if you want to do something to it, if you engage in new construction that requires site plan review, if there is a change in use or a change in ownership, and ownership is not defined in the policy as property ownership, then in those circumstances, the policy will be enforced and the sign has to be taken down.
Thank you for the
The
clarification.
ordinance will be enforced.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So,
Who wrote this policy? It's signed by the director of the building department.
But at the bottom of the policy, you see, I believe it's typed.
CL
Poll.
Poll Sign Mort JKH 51214.
Correct. That's the initials of John King.
Okay,
Does that
I would like to not discuss the use, and let's just do the findings of fact that we discussed, and then maybe Cindy would like to make a different type of a proposal for our discussion at that point in time. So, sorry for all the confusion there, but anything referencing to the type of use or whatever is not part of my finding of fact motion that we want the board to consent on. So that's my motion.
Can I ask for clarification? I'm trying to understand, is the board interpreting the sign moratorium this evening?
No.
No.
So
Not
you're
in this motion.
You're not going to be applying it one way or the other?
It is a policy, not an ordinance.
Oh, I understand that.
So no, the answer is no.
Is the board going to be considering the practical difficulties sections of your ordinance as well as the
You
14?
need to step up to the mic, please.
Also wonder whether the board is going to be considering the practical difficulties section of the ordinance and also of the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act, which deals with variance requests in front of the ZBA. There is the 14 elements, the 14 points that you've got, but I haven't heard any discussion about the practical difficulties as one of the factors that is contained in your ordinance. I'm just wondering, is that going to be part of the discussion here this evening as well?
Yes, I believe it will.
Okay,
Well, so
all right.
let me clarify. You have a sign ordinance that, as the city attorney pointed out, is adopted pursuant to other authority besides the Zoning Enabling Act, and is not part of your zoning ordinance. And you are charged separately, not in your usual role as the Zoning Board of Appeals, but as the appeals body under the sign ordinance, which is not a zoning ordinance. And so the 14 findings are your 14 findings for sign variance requests. The other findings that are contained in the zoning ordinance related to variance requests are not applicable to a sign variance request.
In other words, those 14 points go specifically to the two code sections that we've been asked right here,
That's right.
right? That's it.
When the sign ordinance was modified, and when the moratorium came in place, we needed to put in operation an appeal on that issue alone. Not under the variance, but to allow a separate appeal to consider circumstances where variation might come into play. And those 14 factors were used as a guide specifically for that. Practical difficulty was not a reference point in that particular ordinance.
I'm going to take a look at the ordinance here for a moment because I know there's a practical difficulty section. And I also know that the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act is the law that empowers the Zoning Board of Appeals, creates the Zoning Board of Appeals, and gives you the rights for reviewing any sort of a decision related to land use. So I'm just going to place that statement on the record as an objection to any decision by this body that goes beyond the Michigan Zoning Enabling Act and fails to consider the practical difficulties that are both part of the ordinance and part of the ordinary land use review process. So I know that you said that you'd be getting to that, and I didn't want to turn this into any kind of a legal battle,
Well,
but
actually, what I want to.
I just think that this is veering way off
Well,
the,
let me ask a question, though.
traditional
You're
course.
talking about something, wouldn't that be under a separate, we're only supposed to be looking, you applied for a zoning variance under these two things, correct? And am I incorrect in the things that he is talking about would be a separate variance.
They would be in, I believe the provisions of the city code to which he's referring are in chapter 34, which is the land development regulations.
So that would be
not
a
in chapter
different
36.
request for a different variance.
Yes, it's not a request that can be made. A request for a sign
Okay.
variance is pursuant to chapter 36, which is the sign code.
And that's what's
The
on
sign
front.
code does not include practical difficulties.
Correct.
That is exactly correct, because it operates under the other act,
Correct. Okay.
the Home Rule Act.
I think that should be one of our findings of fact, then.
I
Well,
would,
let's get through this one. We can always have another motion for other findings of fact.
We haven't supported the first initial motion yet.
That's right.
It's still just on the table, so. I didn't hear what she said.
I was just suggesting that should probably be another finding of fact, is that we've been advised that these two requests for the Chapter 36 of the sign ordinance does not take into effect practical difficulty,
Take into account.
take into account practical difficulty.
In other words, that's
That's
not
different than what
our
I understood you
jurisdiction.
said the first time, so I
Yeah, that's fine.
apologize. So, yeah, I think that would be pertinent to making the rest of what our decision is follow the rules that we are applying.
So if I understand it, we're using the 14 findings of fact as listed in the recommendation letter from McKenna and Associates, in addition to the clarification between the actual ordinance versus the policy regarding change of ownership and the interpretation of our building director and attorney. And then as item number 16.
I took that off.
Took that off.
Oh, you took that off?
Yes.
I took that off.
Okay, and then as item number 15, then, we want to discuss the reference as to Chapter 34, and the Enabling Act does not apply to the variance as requested for sign regulation under Chapter 36, followed the Home Rule Act.
Yes,
Right.
that's
I might
that's the way
state it a
understand
little bit differently, and maybe this is not the right way to state it, that I would state it that we did add one thing to say that we determined that there's no practical location for a monument sign, so that would be like point 15. And then if we want to say point 16, that the basis of this interpretation is our guidance on Chapter 36 for sign regulations, and the interpretation guidelines that were given, points 1 through 14, is what we're following in order to make this assessment relative to Chapter 36.
And we
And
just added
just
a
state it
couple-
like that.
Do you agree with that, Cindy?
I agree.
Okay,
I'll make a support.
okay. Well,
May I just make one more statement on the record before you
Sure.
move forward? I'm just looking at your ordinance here again. Zoning Board of Appeals powers are defined in section 34.542. Those things specifically say that non-dimensional variances, non-use or dimensional variances, shall be granted in compliance with section 34-545. That's the instructions that your ordinance provides to this body. Section 545 and also section 544 deals specifically with the non-use dimensional variance and the bases for granting those. That's what we've applied for. We've applied for a non-use dimensional variance. And so I'm just very surprised that we're not following.
A non-use? You mean, you've applied for a reuse?
We applied, you either have uses, which are industrial use, residential use. Those are for purposes of interpreting zoning laws and classifying things as use or non-use. Somebody says, I want to be able to use this property for a business. And we say, no, you can't, because the use that's provided for in the zoning ordinance for that property is residential.
Right.
So that's the use, and the non-use would be things that are not related to that type of use. Dimensional, size, right? So everything that's not related to use, a use category as defined by your ordinance is going to be a non-use dimensional aspect of the property. We're looking for a non-use dimensional variance. And I don't know
Well,
how
it-
you, I don't,
it's-
I'm just putting on the record that I'm objecting to the standards that are being applied here because I believe that your ordinance is quite clear that whenever you're considering a non-use dimensional variance, you have to consider the practical difficulties, and you're ignoring that.
Well,
But you're looking at a different ordinance.
I
I'm
would
looking
say-
at the
Land
ordinance that
development.
empowers, I'm looking at the ordinance that empowers the ZBA.
For
There is-
purposes of the land development regulations. but-
There is no other separate ordinance that creates or empowers the ZBA.
Excuse me. I would remind you that your variance request that you submitted, Pep Boys request a variance from the City of Clawson sign ordinance, Section 36-2.
Thank you.
There was no Section 34 reference that you asked for a variance. And what we've been advised by our council and our city planner is that the 14 points are what we should look at and consider in approving a variance under Section 36.
The distinction here is simple. You don't have signs regulated per se in the section dealing with the powers of the ZBA or the standards that the ZBA has to apply when dealing with the non-use dimensional variance. We are requesting a variance of what ordinarily would be required under the sign ordinance, assuming that the sign ordinance applies at all given the moratorium. We haven't waived that argument. But when considering that variance from the other specific sign dimensional sizes and all in a different part of your ordinance, my position and the statement I'm making on the record here is that I believe this body is bound to consider those according to the standards provided for in the ordinance that govern the actions of the ZBA. ZBA has limited powers, and there are certain dictates in your own ordinance that require you to consider certain things in granting a non-use dimensional variance. If that's going to be ignored here, then obviously you're going to proceed on your own council's opinion. But I'm just placing on the record my objection to that, and I believe that's dead wrong. So.
Okay. Thank you for your comments. John, do you have any comments about that?
Can I?
I think the record's clear on that.
Okay. Thank you.
Motion, we have a second.
We have a
To
motion
accept
for
the
findings of fact.
Correct.
A
And I
motion
would
for the
really
findings of
like
fact.
to not do this again. So let's, at least if we agree on these 16 points,
Okay.
we don't have to bring them up again.
All right,
So-
so we have a motion on the table. I believe Ed made the motion. Do we have a second?
A second.
Cindy seconded. Victoria, can you take the roll?
Mr. Snaki,
Yes.
Ms. Scripture,
Yes.
Ms. Cindy Smith,
Yes.
Ms. Diane Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Parker.
Yes.
I don't know where to go, but I'd like to make a motion to table this further discussion until we get clarification from our city administration based upon the fact that it appears that if we continue without some clarification, because I'm not a legal expert in this and I rely on the documents and the professional interpretation of those documents as a baseline. And if I'm not being directed to consider all of the documents at that point in time, then maybe we should table this for a while.
Again, let me indicate for the record, and I'm referring to segment 1 of the handout you received tonight, and section 2, and this is the petitioner's documentation, refers to variance.
there's standard language in the text, and then their language is Pep Boys requests a variance from the City of Clawson sign ordinance 36-2, and that it be allowed to retain and use a pole sign structure on the property per the attached drawings. Unique circumstances supporting such variance are set forth in the attached addendum. So they're relying on 36-4. Throwing in 34 at this point in time is blindsiding. This is their document. If they had wanted to change it and get the right section, it would have been revised and submitted as a revised document, and it was not. So the consideration of Section 34 is not relevant in this proceeding based on their petition, based on the planner's response to that petition, which refers to the 14 items in the sign ordinance. It's as simple as that.
So I withdraw my motion because it's been clarified.
Okay. Is there any further questions, comments, discussions?
I would question the applicants to see if they wish to revise their request, and we could table our decision on said matter.
Isn't,
Yes, we would welcome that opportunity. And if the
Well, I believe that the way she's doing it is asking that be a motion for the board.
Yeah, that's
So
a
maybe
motion
we
for the
should
board.
look at whether or not we want to consider that tonight.
And here's my response to that. And I'm not going to express vehemence about it. I'm going to give you a little background information on preliminary discussions that I had with the law firm when this matter was commenced. And it was commenced under the prospect that they'd go under the sign ordinance. And then in the discussion, they also said, but if we don't get it, then we'll handle alternatives. And I said, well, if you're going to do that, you have to file a new application and a new hearing if you're going under a different section. That was the understanding. So they proceeded with 36. Now, if they want to go back and do something else, that's a whole new game. But you're requested at this time to respond to this application, not a request to expand that application by saying, oh, by the way, let us supplement the record and go under 34 and have you consider different standards that are contrary to what you've decided tonight and which are totally irrelevant to the situation.
We gave the applicant an opportunity by advising them both of when we had to publish notice of the hearing, and then also when your packets would go out to either, in the first instance, modify the request if they wanted to do so, to ask for a variance that was less out of conformity with the ordinance, and then in the second circumstance to provide you with materials for the meeting by that date. They did not wish to avail themselves of the former opportunity, so we published the notice as it was requested, and in my opinion, that's what's before you tonight for you to vote on. You have made your findings. They should point you one way or the other in terms of a decision on the request that's before you. They have every right to apply for a different variance in the future if they now, in retrospect, think better of what they've asked for. They also have a right to appeal the decision that you're going to make tonight.
May I just comment briefly? It seemed to me that it would be much more economical. You know, we're not here to try to pick a fight. We're here to try to get things resolved. We've already indicated that we are willing to work with the building officials here. We just haven't received any direction as to exactly what would be the alternative that they would want or ask for here. The one alternative with regard to signage on the side of the building is impractical. It just doesn't work. It can't work. And as a practical matter, it would be silly to try to insist upon that when it's not going to create the visibility that everyone else has with a monument sign. There's no real point here served in going through and having a vote tonight if in fact what we intend to do is simply refile another variance request, and we'll be right back here with a fresh start. Makes more sense to, I think, table this particular application, allow there to be an amendment to it, and then proceed forward. There's no substantive difference to this body, other than we have to start all over again next time we're here if we have a new variance request. I prefer not to have a new variance request. I prefer to have an amended variance request, and then we can resume this discussion at the next hearing so that we don't have to start all over again. There's just, I don't think, any point served in forcing us to go through that whole process one more time.
Okay.
I don't understand the insistence upon trying to make life more difficult for us when we're trying to work with the city.
Thank you.
I'm just going to say, everyone knows that I have always been magnanimous and cooperative with opposing counsel. But when the request is made to defer action that you're considering now, so some substitute can come into play, it's a substitute motion. It's an entirely different proceeding. It requires different evidence than what's presented on the record right now. You want to talk about a cluttered record? That would do it. The better way, and council has said, we're willing to work with the city. Best way to do it is rule on this motion, make a decision on this motion, and I'll bet $1 to a donut, if it succeeds in denying the request, there's going to be some meetings between the applicant and the city to try to work out something before they file a 34-section appeal. Thank you. Sorry about the vehemence, but I'm missing the Michigan game.
Thank you. Are there any other comments the board has?
No.
Okay. I'll entertain a motion.
Madam Chair, I make a motion based upon the findings of fact, as is supported by the discussion here and our previous work, which includes the recommendations by McKenna and Associates and our legal counsel, that we deny the request for section 36-2
No, 36-3F.
for chapter 36 sign regulation, 36-3F nonconforming signs, to not allow the reuse of the existing nonconforming sign support pole, and chapter 36 sign regulation, non-residential sign regulations, to allow a pole sign, to not allow the pole sign in excess of 8 feet in height, in excess of 32 square feet, based upon the information provided today.
Under 36.9, or 36-9.
Yes.
I second.
Okay. We have a motion and a second. Victoria, can you call the roll, please?
Ms. Scripture,
Yes.
Ms. Cindy Smith,
Can I ask for a clarification before I vote? The ordinance was to allow the reuse and to allow the pole sign in excess of 8 feet, and we are seeking to deny that request, or are we denying to not allow? It seemed to be a double negative as you were talking. I just want to clarify for the record.
Clarify what your intention
I
was.
apologize for that in the rambling here. We are denying their request to reuse the existing pole sign. We are denying a pole sign in excess of 8 feet, in excess of 32 square feet as presented today.
And that was what I understood when I made my support and
So
my
an-
vote.
So an affirmative vote would vote to deny also.
Correct.
Under
I-
that ordinance that was applied for.
Yes, I agree to deny the variance as written.
Ms. Diane Smith,
Yes.
Mr. Parker,
Yes.
Mr. Sinaki.
Yes.
Motion passed. Thank you.
Oh, now we get to elect officers. We still got another agenda. In here, I thought that was the end.
This will be quick. So the next item on the agenda is an election of officers. As you know, our glorious leader moved. So is there anybody who would like to be chair? Or should I open up for nominations?
Yes, I think I was going to say, shouldn't we open up for nominations for chair?
Nominations would be in order.
I nominate you.
I support. Do you accept?
Nomination
Yes.
support for Diane.
Does anybody else want it? Yeah, I'll accept.
You are doing a lovely
I
job.
figured this was coming.
Call that by acclamation, council?
We appreciate it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
So we do need a vice chair. That position is open now. So is there any nominations for vice chair?
Second vice.
I would like to nominate Mr. Sanaki.
I would respectively decline, because then if I have to be chair, I can't make any motions. And that has been
That's
shown.
his role.
That has been shown to be difficult, if almost impossible, for me to do when I sat in that chair before.
I was kind of thinking about you, Cindy.
Okay, I will accept.
I'll support.
Well, if you're reluctant, Reese, do you want to do it? Jay, you want
I
to do it?
am happy to
It's-
support Cindy. I am absolutely happy to acclamation aye.
Well,
Cindy.
she has to be.
She just said she accepts.
She has to
I
be.
will accept.
You're ruling. All righty.
I will do my
She
part.
did say that. I heard it.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Secretary too, or no?
I don't think we have a secretary.
Didn't
We
have
have
her.
that position, but I don't.
You didn't have one formally, I don't
No,
think.
we haven't had one formally, so you can have it. It's really a title only.
Because there never can, if two of you are gone, well, no,
No.
two of you could be gone and you could still have a meeting, so there would be.
Well, aren't we
a-
supposed to be getting an alternate at some point?
You're going to discuss that next Wednesday.
Are we? Outstanding.
I'm going to chit chat with you after this meeting. What do you mean?
Meet your neighbors.
Well, you're going to be there next Wednesday too, right?
I believe that I am.
Outstanding.
Okay. Are there any other?
I'd like to thank John and Greg for their support and patience
Yes.
Yes.
with our
Your legal
board.
interpretation of ordinances versus policy.
Right.
It's very difficult when you get into these contested things, not being skilled in this area.
Well, no, you are skilled, but, no one's really skilled in the legal area. Sometimes lawyers aren't. But the point of the matter is that you're a receptive board that looks realistically at what your requirements are and your authority. And that's what you did this evening. It's it, clear and simple. And that's the role we expected.
Thank you. Is there any other business, Greg?
I just wanted to point out the training that we put in your packets. Two of you have expressed interest in going. I know Reese already registered. Ed wanted to, and Susie's indicated that she will register you for that if you have not already.
No, I didn't, because it was asking for some kind of code.
Yeah, okay.
So we need to follow up
And
with
so if there's anybody else, did you say tomorrow's the deadline too, or is that just
is.
early registration deadline, or?
I believe it is.
I think it's the
Register
deadline.
by January 19th.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think it's the deadline.
So does anybody else want to go?
I'd go.
Jay would go as well? Okay.
Yeah, I'll be out of town.
So you'll take care of that for us then, and we'll show up?
I personally will not, but.
Susie will do a great job with it.
Make it so
Susie
number
has
one.
suggested that she will, so. We'll make that happen.
Thank you.
Can't remember.
I have nothing else.
Okay.
Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you. Motion to adjourn?
Wait, do we have, oh, sorry. We didn't have to do public discussion, even though no one's here?
No. Would you like to say anything? Thank you. All right, meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Let me just mention.